Hi there, Andy. Oh, we can't hear you, Andy.
Ah, your
There we go.
evening.
Yes. How are you?
Fine. We just had a good session hosted by Astrid. If
Yes, I
you
just caught the very
want
end of it, which is great and yeah, terrific. And I saw you mention footprints, so there might be a few people come to this as well. I can see a few names from the previous session coming in, which is great. So we can talk some nuts and bolts and as well as the strategies that I heard you discussing at the end. I'm just trying to raise Dugan. I'll just send him the link just in case he's having troubles. It's on his way.
I know that to everyone, I know that we're due to start. We're just trying to link up Dugan Fraser, who's the third member of the panel.
Well, I guess we could start.
Okay.
Hello there. Sorry I'm late. I was struggling to get into the system.
Oh, good.
Hooray.
Great. I do good. So, Andy, would you like me to share my screen? I can share the slides.
Sure. That would be excellent. Thank you.
Okay. There, is that working for you?
Um, Works for me. Is it okay with everyone else? Can you see the slides?
Yep, I'm seeing them.
Great.
Great.
It's okay. We had some problems yesterday. That's great. That's great. And Dugan, when I'm doing this, I can't see the chat, so if you can keep an eye on the chat.
Okay,
Please.
I'll do that.
Thank you.
So with
Okay,
that,
over to you, Andy.
please use the chat liberally. It's an important part of doing these things virtually. And welcome to the session. The session is provided by Footprint Evaluation. Patricia Dugan and myself, along with Jane, are the four founding members of Footprint Evaluation that is hosted by Better Evaluation and funded by the Global Evaluation Initiative of the World Bank. Can we go to the next slide, please? So our session is the introduction to the evaluation we need. And this photograph is a rare event from our small farm on the west coast of Canada on Vancouver Island, where we get snow. Actually, we're in a rainforest and have experienced drought for the last 3 years, just indicating the severity of the climate change that we're all part of now. I want to acknowledge that I speak to you and I live and work on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish Nation, who never ceded their ownership of this land, and so are still the rightful custodians of all the land on which we are located in British Columbia. Next slide, please. So this is briefly how we're going to structure the session. There's much we can talk about. Footprint evaluation is focused on, has the mission of developing guidance and materials and resources and tools for mainstreaming sustainability into all evaluation, including all evaluations that would otherwise be focused solely on the human system or primarily on the human system. And in fact, our vision is that equity and sustainability are fellow travelers on the evaluation that we need. Patricia is going to showcase some of the methods that are being used, have been used, and could be used for evaluation of environmental impacts. And Dugat's going to talk about how we can get to sustainability ready evaluation so that all evaluators and all evaluations can incorporate sustainability. Just by way of introduction, could we go to the next slide? There are a few things that the slide is sort of might be.
That's really weird. I'll fiddle about, see if I can fix it. Here we go.
There you go. So our position and the position of many, for example, would be the positions of the UN Environment Evaluation Group coming out of their recent stock taking on sustainability, or the Canadian Evaluation Society for our stock taking on sustainability, is that we need to immediately mainstream sustainability in all evaluation undertakings. Now, there are two things that are prerequisites for this and that evaluators need to address. One is we need to adopt a worldview that values the natural system and recognizes it's essential for life. Within Footprint, we take the view learned from indigenous thinking of stewardship, where we regard other species as our non-human relatives and other things like air, water, minerals, rocks, the earth, as also essential. So we'd say we take on stewardship. Our worldview is one of stewardship for all of our non-living relatives, non-human relatives, and non-living things. And it all has value, and it all is the foundation or the underpinning that supports human life, our life on the planet. Different access to resources in the natural system is also a source of profound inequity, as are the harms from use of the natural system through environmental justice. So equity and sustainability are closely linked and cannot be separated. We need to adopt a mindset that, as evaluators, we need a mindset that expects win-win approaches. We take the position that you can't have sustainability without equity, and you can't have equity without sustainability. We need win-win approaches that advance both sustainability and equity. And our focus is on evaluation practitioners. Until recently, the two stock takings I've already mentioned, they illustrated that until recently, evaluation has only had minimal interest in the natural system. Minimal. And that we don't have the intellectual resources, the peer-reviewed publications, the books, the guidance materials, basically the positions in universities and think tanks to promote sustainability and evaluation. We don't have any of that. So it's up to us as evaluation practitioners to do that. So we're the breakers of new ground. And footprint evaluation is focused on evaluation practitioners at providing and working with practitioners and providing and developing the resource materials that we need in order to mainstream sustainability. The existing momentum is tremendous. The awareness and concern about environment and sustainability and climate is growing in leaps and bounds. And in fact, I would posit that evaluation is well behind the rest of the world's thinking on this. Our current methods and knowledge are enough to get us going. They'll get better as we go on. They'll get better as we work with practitioners, and practitioners work together with communities, with knowledge communities, to basically start including sustainability in evaluation, but also include evaluation in efforts to improve sustainability and equity. Can we go to the next slide? Now, as evaluators, I think you skipped one slide.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Evaluators, we take a theory of change as important. My view is that we shouldn't say what the theory of change should be for how we're going to mainstream sustainability and equity into evaluation, but we could point to some key elements that are normally found in key assumptions, key elements that we commend to you to develop your own theories of change, or come and work with us through our discussion groups and other vehicles to contribute to the development of a theory of change. First thing has to do with our worldview. The natural system has value. Second thing is the natural system is on its last legs. Urgency is the name of the day. So a theory of change has to embody, it has to enshrine, it has to promote and facilitate urgent responses. An environment is a major mechanism for inequality. So the restoring the natural system goes hand in hand with equity. The key mechanisms are going to be this awareness I've already pointed to, evaluation practitioners, and the co-generation of knowledge with knowledge holding communities. For example, indigenous communities, natural sciences, facilitative sciences. So we need to work with other communities of knowledge to be able to do what we need to do to mainstream sustainability and to mainstream evaluation in efforts to save our planet. Can you go to the next slide? In addition to those elements, well, theory of change has key outcomes. The theory of change needs to extend well beyond our traditional theories of change, which are focused on the intervention. They need to include all direct effects in both human and natural systems. They need to be use-seeking. They need to expect and require win-win solutions to problems. They can't say, well, you're doing okay, you're still harming the environment, but it was a good try. Let's do better next time. 2030 is only 9 years away. The typical national program cycle is about 5 years. International development project and program cycles are 6 years. We only have one cycle to the really important milestones that we need to achieve by 2030. So we need use seeking. We need immediately to go to win-win solutions. And a theory of change has to include that. We pointed in numerous writings to temporal and spatial scales, natural system, they're different. Part of that is this accelerated change in the urgency. And affected and knowledge holding communities need to be part of the evaluation. We need co-generation with them. Those are key outcomes that we expect to see in theories of change. Context is urgency, I've already mentioned that. Shorter evaluation cycles. In a typical development evaluation, our first evaluation is a midterm. That's 3 to 4 years after the thing has been started. So in a new initiative, our first evaluation is going to be in 2025. with only 5 years left. Our full evaluation is going to occur a couple of years later, around 2028, when the time has virtually expired. So we need much shorter evaluation cycles. We need to advance evaluation upwards, and we need to expect and require rapid and successful project inception. Typically, a development project or a federal or national program takes a year during inception when it's getting things in order. We don't have a year to squander on that. And evaluation or the supervision and oversight missions that we need to partner with need to have set a much higher, more ambitious standard that recognizes the urgency of the undertaking and applies that in the evaluation and supervision mission judgments. And we need much more adaptive program management. Can we go to the next slide? I want to note that Canadian Evaluation Society, the UN, sorry, that should be evaluation group, not environment group. I don't know what got into me. Stock taking show that evaluation is of limited interest. For example, in Canada, we looked at all federal evaluations over a recent 2-year period, and we found hardly any included sustainability or the natural system. In other words, those evaluations took a stance of extraction. They did not regard the natural system as having value. Similarly, in the UN evaluation group, they found similar findings. They found similar results. I want to note that things are changing rapidly, though. 2 of the 3 keynotes at this conference focus on sustainability, but only 10% of the sessions, under 10%, actually 6% in my count, really focus or address sustainability. I think that what that reflects is a good thing. It's a good thing because EES, like other evaluation associations, are getting serious or addressing sustainability. But our field, as the stock takings say, is still well behind the curve. We are not yet doing that, so we don't have the material that we would bring to a conference to make a presentation on sustainability. When we meet next year, we need to have that, because next year will be 1 year closer to 2030. So we need to expect EES, Canadian Evaluation Society, all of the other VOPI national evaluation conferences should be expecting 20, 30, 40% of all presentations are addressing sustainability. Because what's going to be new on the block is that we're going to be mainstreaming sustainability. That's the new thing that is coming to all evaluations, whether it has to do with gender, equity, methods, whatever. The new thing on the block is mainstreaming sustainability and equity together. And so that should be reflected in what is presented at the next round of evaluation conferences. Right now, we're reinforcing the way things were. We're actually providing invalid conclusions in our evaluations. We are failing on what is really important to us is validity, because we have built-in positive and negative bias. Because we exclude stuff of really important value on which everything we evaluate depends. We exclude the natural system. So by that exclusion, we're introducing bias. Validity fails. Our conclusions are invalid. We need to correct that. We need to correct that urgently. So in terms of methods, Patricia will share with us some of the methods, and then Dugan will help us understand how we can work together to get to scale on mainstream sustainability. Over to you, Patricia.
Okay, thank you.
Or did we want to take questions?
Yes, I think it's a good idea to take questions. I'm trying to stop sharing at the moment. Yeah.
That was my problem. We're so bound up with just getting this thing going in a virtual sense. We forgot the housekeeping thing. So telling you, talking with you how we were going to organize the session. So we'll have direct questions and answers after each presentation, and then we'll have lots of time for discussion at the end. Good. And are there any questions in the chat that we need to address? So if you want to pose any questions or challenges.
No, there's nothing in the chat box yet, but I'd really like to. Taruna Gupta, hello Taruna, has raised her hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, Dugan. Thank you, Andy. That was a really interesting talk. I'm part of the Footprints Evaluation Group, and one thing I wanted to ask you, it's a very basic question, I apologize, is that in terms of sustainability and equity at the conference, a lot of people have been talking about it, but as an initiative, do you intend to actually define what you mean by that and some sort of criteria? So you're talking about mainstreaming it, but in practice, what does that mean? And maybe because I'm a young emerging evaluator, I need the sort of basics on that, but it'd be great if you can elaborate or provide some clarity.
Let me take a start on the sustainability piece, and perhaps my colleagues can join on the sustainability and equity. Sustainability from our traditional view of sustainability comes from the Brundtland Commission in the mid-90s, a UN commission. And the focus there was to focus on that what we do today should not in any way impair the capacity and the ability of future generations to do what they need to do. In other words, our footprint, our effect on the natural system shouldn't impair their abilities to pursue development, to pursue equity, to achieve development and to achieve equity, and to achieve honorable and useful and valued lives for all of us, including our non-human relatives and the other things. So that's what we mean by sustainability. We're in a position right now where we've wrought so much destruction on the natural system that we absolutely need to move well past to do no harm to a restoration. We need to be restoring the natural system. So in Footprint, we think of sustainability in this intergenerational way, or the way that Indigenous people talk about it in terms of stewardship for our non-human relatives and all other things. And we recognize the need for restorative actions to help bring the natural system back to a position where future generations are able to pursue the lives they need to. And our temporal scale is quite important in this, is that we think in terms of 7 generations. We look backwards 3 generations to the history of our harm causing. We look at our current generation and what we're doing now and our urgent need to move to restoration. And our concern is the next 3 generations of the world we leave those 3 generations. We want sustainability for them. Colleagues on the equity.
I mean, I don't know whether this is really part of the question that Taruna asked. Maybe, Taruna, are you convinced? Does that make sense to you?
It really, really helps. I just typed it in the chat, the sustainability thing, and I mean, it makes perfect sense. I've heard so many explanations of it, even like talking about this long-term perspective. There was a talk on it earlier, but it was fantastic. I would love if you could touch on equity. Thank you.
Andy, you've done a great job. Why don't you just touch on the equity intersection as well? I think it's very useful.
We feel that you can't have equity without sustainability. You can't have sustainability without equity. Access to resources, to clean air, to clean water, access to nature and a natural system is an important part of well-being. Access to traditional lands for healing and for well-being is critical for Indigenous people, who we in North America have kicked off and excluded from their traditional lands. So we can see in that the binding of sustainability and equity, that the indigenous people need access to their traditional lands for well-being. You need access to resources for just everyday survival and existence. You need an environment that is not harming you through air pollution, through dirty water, through heavy metals in soils, through noxious gases that you have to live downstream of. And with climate change, the people who are most exposed to climate are the poor, the disadvantaged, and the disenfranchised. They're the people who are directly in path of hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and they're the people who have the least access to the resources to build resilience to these things and to recover from these things. So however you look at it, equity and sustainability go hand in hand. The greatest beneficiaries of achieving sustainability need to be those who are currently suffering and historically have suffered most from the inequality of access to resources and being downstream of the pathways of crappy air, crappy water, and horrible and worsening climatic events. So they go together. The two struggles are bound up together.
And I mean, Taruna, the point is that you'd be more likely to conclude that an intervention was successful if you didn't ask about the environmental impacts on a poor component of the affected people. So you could well walk away concluding that something had achieved its impacts. But if you didn't ask about the people at the edges, you may not come with a proper understanding and a complete picture of what the real effects have been. Patricia, is there anything you'd like to add to this intersection between sustainability and equity?
Yeah, I just think it's such an important message that they are linked, and it's particularly unfortunate that the session on do no harm evaluation is on at the same time as this. So, because I think they shouldn't be in opposition. They are linked, and it would be good to have been able to connect. So I guess we'll all watch the recordings and make those connections more. Barbara's put up a question in the chat.
Barbara, would you care to speak to your question? And it's very nice that you're here. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for this another great session here today. And this Andy just mentioned resilience as well, and that's actually another concept which I think is being tossed around often, which certainly I'm not very clear about how that now relates in this intersectionality between sustainability and equity. Where do you see that role? Thanks.
Andy, would you care to respond?
If you'll accept a response that says, I think there's been huge efforts spent on resilience, on developing precise techniques and measurements for resilience in the human system. And over in the environmental sciences, there's been a lot of effort at developing measures and mechanisms for resilience in the natural system. And the two worlds exist separately, and we need them to come together. Too often, we see evaluations that are looking at climate adaptation, which is fundamentally about resilience, building resilience, ability to recover from and avoid the worst effects of ever worsening, deepening climatic effects, and become more resilient in that recovery. And almost all of those evaluations focus on resilience in the human system. None of them talk about building resilience in the natural system. And yet the win-win gateway to actually achieving sustainability is almost always through the natural system. The problem that resilience is trying to address is a problem that comes from the natural system. We don't have enough water. We have too much water. We have flooding. We have drought. All of these are natural system effects. Human beings need to address these human system effects, but their addressing them needs to focus on bringing health to the natural system. as a way of building resilience, of contributing to the resilience in the human system. So the fundamental problem or challenge we have in resilience right now isn't a technical measurement. We have more than enough of that right now, and it's actually confusing the endeavor. Our challenge is addressing both of them together, resilience of human and natural systems, and finding the win-win pathways towards restoration in both systems. And the final point I would make on that is do no harm is a past standard. We need restoration now. The period for do no harm is long past. We need to be restored.
And you say that even though our good friends are doing a session on do no harm in the room next door, that we'll talk more about that.
Yes.
Andy, I want to also Scott's introduced a concept that is this idea of the different spatial and temporal scales, and you did mention that in your input, where he's saying that if you don't look in the long run effects, then you could conclude that something has had a successful or positive outcome if you don't take account of how it affects an ecosystem in terms of poisons or pesticides. Do you want to just speak to that? And then I'm suggesting that we go over to Patricia, because I know she's got a lot to say on some interesting methods.
Yeah.
Are you reading Scott's point?
No, I was also reading Boris's, which I want to just agree with. In Footprint, we refer to the DAC standard on sustainability as durability. And OECD DAC is engaged in an endeavor to consider how it's going to address sustainability. It gives permission to interpret the criteria as you need to. So I suggest you just go ahead and take sustainability literally and address the natural system as part of it. Scott is absolutely, totally right. And the key is that when we look at an intervention that we're evaluating, we don't stay within the narrow programmatic frame. We extend the temporal and spatial scales to the long-term effects and to the extended effects. We connect it to everything else. So if my simplistic way is I facilitate the intervention people in developing a theory of change, and I ask them, where is it? What was already there? What is it changing? And we start extending the boundaries of the intervention. And I say, you're not accountable for that because you didn't have the resources. You didn't have the remit, but you're affecting that both positively and negatively. That's included in the evaluation so that when you go to renewal, you'll be looking for this expanded territory to start addressing the very real and very serious things that Scott is pointing to.
Thank you so much, Andy. So Patricia, over to you.
Good, thank you. Oh, and I'll also pick up the criteria in a bit more detail. Okay. Yep, we got that. That's working again. I'm just being extra careful because of yesterday problems. That's working, Dugan, is it?
Yes, that's good.
Good. Okay. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands I'm speaking from you today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of you are living, learning and working from today. I want to spend a bit of time sharing some of the methods around footprint evaluation that we've been discovering, finding, sharing, trying out. Very much a work in progress and very much something that is a collaborative knowledge building effort. And I'm really delighted to see some of the people who've been involved in that here today. So I wanted to start out by being clear that when we talk about footprint evaluation, this is the sustainability ready evaluation. It's not the same as footprint calculators. It's not just about calculating the ecological or carbon footprint. That what we're talking about is needing to change every aspect of the evaluation process. That if you think about evaluation, we say, well, when we're doing an evaluation, what do we need from it? How can we answer the questions? How do we support use of the answers? And how do you manage and govern the process? So better evaluation as many of you know, is a collaboration to build and share knowledge about methods and options and processes and approaches in evaluation that answer these questions. And so it's the materials are ordered around what we call the Rainbow Framework that really looks at all these tasks involved. And so when we're looking at footprint evaluation, what we're doing is identifying how do we need to adapt all of these aspects of it. So how should we manage and govern the evaluation? What is it that we need from the evaluation? How do we frame it? Who are the intended users and uses? And what are the key evaluation questions? And what is this thing that we're evaluating? What's the theory of change? Where are the boundaries? Which picks up a lot of the questions in the chat before. And then there are methodological questions around answering the questions, answering different types of questions, descriptive questions about what's happened and what's changed, causal questions about why it's changed, evaluative questions about how good that is or bad, or is it getting better, or which is the best option, predictive questions about what do we think is going to happen next, and all of that then to inform action questions. And so as we're doing our work, we're looking at all of these, and the final one, how do we support use of the evaluation? And what we're doing is identifying some of the challenges here and some ways that might be addressed to address those in each of those. So what I'm going to do is rip through each of those sort of 7 areas, sharing some of the examples and methods there. And some of them we are more at the point of having challenges and not yet having some methods. So my plan is to rip through these and then have a chance to discuss particular ones people are interested in. And obviously this material is all coming out in the footprint evaluation materials. So starting with frame, this issue around intended uses, users and questions. And part of what we've found useful here is really revisiting the OECD DAC criteria as a way to get consideration of the natural systems into evaluations. So asking the questions about relevance, about whether it's doing the right things, making sure that that is not just the right things for people, but right things for natural systems. Issues around coherence, about how well it fits with other organisational, national, regional policies and commitments around protecting and restoring the natural system. Impact, which is looking at what difference it makes, making sure that covers consideration of natural systems as well. And sustainability, which is, as Andy said, more about durability. And there's a number of questions there, and I think there's a lot to be thought through on this. What I'd like to talk about here is really one of the issues that came out in one of our case studies we did, which was looking at not just what impact the human systems would have on natural systems, but what impact changes in the natural systems are likely to have on human systems, and particularly looking at whether changes in natural systems would undermine the sustainability of benefits to human systems. So that's one way of looking at this, at the durability of them. In terms of coherence, this is really something we've found very useful as a way to get environmental considerations on the table and on the agenda, to look at policies and commitments that the initiative needs to address. They might be international environmental commitments or treaties, or local or national government policies, agreements or treaties, or organisational strategies. And that's a much better place for evaluators to be, rather than us seeming to just have our own agenda about this, be saying this is your own organisation's agenda or your own government's agenda that you need to consider. Found the World Factbook, for example, is a fantastic source to actually identify what are the international agreements that, in this case, the European Union or a particular country has actually signed, and that then provides some criteria for judging the value of what's being done and allowing you to get it on the table. The issue on impact very clearly speaks to environmental impacts. And so if the OECD criteria is looking at impact, you actually have permission to talk about environmental impacts and actually are required to. So this is all about getting it on the table. Having got it on the table, how are you going to answer it? One of the products that's come out of the Footprint Initiative so far is a revised checklist around key evaluation questions to guide footprint evaluations, which is a source for developing the evaluation questions to underpin an evaluation. So, for example, key evaluation question 4, it's in a generic form, talking about how good, valuable and important are the outcomes and impacts. Has a detailed explanation and some sub-questions that's talking about not just human systems but also natural systems. So these are a prompt, a guide for either developing the key evaluation questions in an RFP or a terms of reference, or at the inception stage for evaluators to come back and say, well, you've had this type of a question, but given your commitments to these international obligations, it would be appropriate to revise the key evaluation question to very explicitly include the natural system. So these are some methods that you can use up front around the framing of the evaluation. The second chunk I want to talk about is the issue about how we define what it is that's being evaluated and how we set the boundaries. And theories of change are often a way that does that, but often does it in a way that's very unhelpful, that only talks about project activities and intended outcomes and lots of boxes and arrows in between. But as we've found, those activities can contribute to other outcomes, and other activities can be contributing to the intended outcomes. So thinking more thoughtfully about theories of change is a really important part of this. One of the things we've done is to develop a revised theory of change that identifies particular impacts on the natural systems from the human systems and vice versa, and that those impacts are not necessarily going to be linear types of relationships. So some of this can be thinking about the constructions and physical installations, both when they're originally built and then when they're maintained, and then some of the activities and how those relate to the natural systems. And it's really important at this point to be very clear that this is not necessarily about negative impacts. We, as part of the Footprint Evaluation project, did a number of thought experiments trying to think about how could we have addressed environment in some evaluations we'd been involved in previously. And I had a particular example that I thought was going to be not able to be connected to it. It was a program that was about reducing recidivism and reducing crime and reducing incarceration so fewer people were going to prison. And it was all about human systems and human benefits. But in fact, then Andy pointed out that if you have fewer people in prison and you need fewer prisons, you don't build new ones, and that building new prisons and maintaining them have negative impacts on the natural systems. So that this program, if it's successful in achieving the social outcomes, would also avoid negative impacts on the natural systems. So this theory of change wasn't just looking at the activities, but the consequences of what was for them final outcomes. The other issue that I've been doing some more recent thinking about is what these theories of change might look like, and it seems very likely that you're going to need to use complexity-informed theories of change. And complexity has been is one of the issues at this conference. It's something that's been of increasing interest over the last 20 years. And we're finally, I think, getting to the point of saying, what does this mean for theories of change? And here are 4 things that's likely to involve. One is that developing them is going to involve collaborative processes with different perspectives and different views about what the boundaries are and bringing different types of knowledge to bear. And they're going to need iterative processes. It won't be a development of a recipe and then you roll it out, but revisiting it as you get new information. That the theories of change will not be linear, that they'll pay attention to feedback loops, non-linear causal trajectories, and the influence of context and starting points. And most importantly, we'll understand that they are a heuristic and not a recipe, and that needs to be adapted and revised and changed as we go forward. I'm going to go on into how we might answer different types of questions So descriptive questions about what's happened. I want to walk through an example that we did that was looking at trying to look at the potential environmental impacts or the impacts on natural systems of a national policy on private sector development. So it wasn't a little local project where you could think about the direct impacts of it. You're trying to think, what is this at a national policy? And one of the components in this was it was encouraging the development of more industrial parks. And so if we think about how we would do that, we made use of a lot of existing data that would not have been immediately obvious to me before doing this exercise. So we had sort of 4 questions about what are the potential risks in terms of negative consequences and potential benefits. What are appropriate risk mitigation strategies? Are they being implemented at all and effectively? And are these changes to the natural system actually happening or likely to happen? And what we found was that previous research and evaluation and guidance on risk management and environmental impact statements were enormously useful sources of information about very predictable risks or risks that might occur in particular circumstances and what should be in place to mitigate those risks. So that information then could inform primary data collection, going and asking people about have they been put in place, what's been happening, what's the data from them, what's been put in response to the adverse events. And then in terms of whether those changes are actually happening, this can present a challenge, particularly where you're talking about a national policy where the impacts could be at many, many different local sites, and it might be very hard to get out and do direct measurement. But here you can draw on potentially government monitoring data and reports if they're actually in place, potentially community monitoring data if there's local groups monitoring environmental quality, incident reports including news items, and other research and evaluation. We were really fortunate to find 2 master's theses where they had actually gone and measured tannery effluent discharge and its impact on the wetland ecosystem, which was one of the key sites. I think in many evaluations we don't make good enough use of existing data, and I think in Footprint we particularly need to draw on what else is there, as well as in some cases doing direct measurement. Causal questions. This is an area we haven't developed as much. I just want to sort of put some ideas out there. I was pretty keen on the idea that non-experimental approaches to causal inference would be much more likely to be of use given the complex natural systems and complex human systems and their interconnections. But there might be cases where conditions are not undergoing ongoing unpredictable change, and it's possible to find a credible counterfactual when an experimental and quasi-experimental design might be appropriate. So I'll be interested in people's thoughts on the causal parts that you might use in an evaluation to address natural systems. I want to particularly focus on evaluative questions about how do you bring together the values and the evidence to make some judgments. And there's 2 types of those that I think have particular importance. One is thinking about a rubric for evaluating the overall impact on natural systems. This speaks to what Andy was referring to earlier, where it's not enough to just have no net harm, that actually what we want is restorative, to be rebalancing the natural environment so it thrives, and to think about how do we develop a rubric to summarise the overall impact on natural systems. And there will need to be a lot more work about how we do that, but even having this scale and making people realise that neutral is not the end of the scale, that neutral's in the middle is really important. The other synthesis is this issue about trade-offs, and this speaks to the discussion we had earlier about equity and sustainability. I think people often think about these as trade-offs, that it can be good for human systems and bad for the natural system, or vice versa. And there was a recent news article in Australia arguing about our development of a massive new coal mine in Australia, which clearly has real concern about natural systems, and it was being framed that anyone who was against it was actually didn't care about poor people in India who weren't going to be able to use the coal to have electricity. So it was very much being framed as a trade-off rather than, as we've talked about, the harm on the natural systems in this is also matched by harm on human systems in terms of the pollution from coal-fired electricity. That's again been very well documented that poorer people suffer more from this. And so what we need to be looking at is how do we frame or find or develop win-win solutions that are good for both of them. And I think this has some real challenges for, again, who's involved in evaluations and how. And I'm nearly at the end, and then I'll be keen to get your comments on this. One of the areas we have touched on in terms of challenges is this issue of how do you report and support use of evaluation. If you've got evaluation reports going to evaluation managers and groups who are used to information about human systems, how do you help them make sense of information about natural systems? How do you help them understand it and pay attention to technical data from unfamiliar fields? And how do you help them understand concepts from the natural systems that might be unfamiliar to them? If they don't have scientific training, they might really not understand that a small difference can potentially have a big impact because of tipping points or because of other reasons. How do you help them understand paying attention to very long time frames or very short time frames? How do you help them to pay attention to impacts on systems that are not under their direct control and management? And so part of what Dugan's going to talk about is about this issue of how do you engage users and commissioners in evaluation as well. And finally, the issue of managing and governing evaluation. And this approach to evaluation does present some challenges to that. This is a lovely summary from Jane and Andy's workshop they did earlier this week about expertise. How do you bring technical expertise into a footprint evaluation? How do you make that savvy use of the specialised natural system expertise? How do you bring them into the team? And how do you bring in boundary spanners to help make that sense of that? What does that mean for the field? How do we connect these different disciplines so they can work together effectively? And what does that mean for who makes decisions about the evaluation? Whose interests need to be represented? Not just the people who be affected by the human system program, but by the natural system. And Scott's example early on was a really good example about that, about whose interests are being represented, formally or directly in these decisions. Is it the farmers who are benefiting from the fertiliser, or is it the people who are being damaged by its effect on water quality? So if you want more information, there's more information on the footprint evaluation page, and you can join the community of practice. But here's the sort of summary around methods, processes and approaches that I've run through really quickly, and I'm very keen to respond to some questions and comments.
Great stuff. Thank you, Patricia. I'm going to put a question in the chat box, actually. And I'm going to ask people, if we want to change the way evaluation gets done, what can we learn from other efforts to do that? And I'm going to ask you to just think about that for a moment. But before we get into that, are there any comments on some of the approaches that Patricia described in her presentation? She talked about making sure that your key evaluation.
Would it help if I put
that would be great. Yeah.
Sure.
So I think what Patricia talked about was how, if you're going to take account of environmental sustainability in your evaluation, you should be thinking about your key evaluation questions. You should be thinking about the DAC criteria as a framework. you could draw on a theory of change that's more embracing of the full complexity of the interventions and where they deliver results, the need to be using existing sources of data, to be talking about causality, getting your evaluative questions right, your approach to synthesis, drawing on technical expertise and making use of boundary spanners, and to be thinking about how you govern your evaluation. So does this challenge you in your way you're currently doing evaluation? Anybody like to venture a view? Would some of these tools be helpful in your practice as an evaluator? Well, I'm gonna leave those questions on the table, and I'm gonna move into this idea that what we want to do through the Footprint Initiative is we really want to, and this phrase was used in the 1880s about Karl Marx and Engels, and they say that Karl Marx turned Engels on his head to stand him on his feet. And I think what we are really talking about is standing evaluation on its head to put it on its feet. Because I think our underlying argument is that evaluations that fail to take account of environmental sustainability are failing in their core mission. And what we really need to do is change the way evaluation gets done. And some of the things we're thinking that could be done in very practical terms are some of the things Patricia has spoken to. So Scott, sorry, it's your own fault for being so engaged and thoughtful, but can I invite you to just speak to the point you've put in there? Because I do think that the way complexity and developmental evaluation are two great examples of how important innovations in evaluation have gotten more traction and come to be influential. Would you like to maybe suggest how that happened? Are you willing to unmute yourself and be heard?
Well, I'm not going to claim to know how it happens. I think it's been a very organic and interconnected process. Everything that I put up there, complex systems analysis, is obviously core to developmental evaluation, and it allows us to look at the bigger picture and kind of break out of these more conventional project and program boxes that development has often been packaged in. And I think big data is one of the tools that can be used. It's just one of the many examples of data science and the incredible, there's been a lot of attention on the uptake, or rather the advancement in data science, and how the field of evaluation, as with complexity theory and systems thinking, has been relatively slow to take on some of these advancements in data science. And data science, of course, is a two-way sword. Decolonization of data, again, is just opening up that box wider and looking at, where our data sources come from, who's involved. So I think these are just, I actually had left the talk for a little bit because my daughter came back and I'd returned and I saw your question up there. So I just immediately popped in a few things shooting from the hip.
I mean, you're forgiven for daring to leave the session briefly. We know you love us, but children are our priorities. Scott, I mean, I think what's interesting about what you say is that innovation and transformation in evaluation has historically been relatively slow. And I think evaluation often lags, which is the point Andy was making, that in many ways evaluation is behind other disciplines in thinking about sustainability and foregrounding it and making it more central to its analysis. And I think the point is that we don't really have the time. It's urgent, it's pressing, we really need to be much more rapid about the way we transform evaluation. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously an urgency. I identify the three key drivers of what I call transformational evaluation, and that's evaluation that's looking to support the urgent transformations that we need in the world today if we're going to be around in the next century. One of them is the uptake of complex systems thinking. The other one is obviously the urgency. And the third one is that evaluation is embedded in the political economy, in the marketplace. And with the SDGs and Global 2030 Agenda having transformation even in its title, to a certain degree, evaluation is following the trends, the economic trends. As interventions are being developed and labeling themselves as having transformational intended results, there's a greater call for evaluation to step up and be able to assess the degree to which that is the case. So I think there's a combination of things that are kind of pushing it into the, floating to the top is a big issue in evaluation. But evaluation has a symbiotic relationship with the market and with the world and all of that. So they both kind of happen, and when we speak about evaluation, I do think to a large degree, I'm talking about a subset of evaluation, because I'd say for the majority of evaluators, it's business as usual. They're not necessarily as focused on some of the issues and concerns and discussions that we encounter at conferences like this or in the literature that we often read.
Look, I think you're completely right. And I think it's this exact mindset of business as usual that we're wanting to challenge. And so I want to describe for you a little bit the process that we followed as part of the Footprint practice. And let's talk about how everybody on the call, can participate. I'm seeing the comments from Barbara. Similar to Scott's point on complexity, the list also strongly resonates with systems thinking and practice as a field, provides lots of useful methods and tools. And then she refers to some work that she thinks is useful. Taruna says the presentation is immensely useful as we're not advocating for new methods, but adding to what is in existence. Patricia, would you agree?
Yeah, I was sort of reflecting on it in terms of, these issues about complexity and systems, and, this stuff's we've been chewing over it for sort of really 20 years.
Yeah.
And I was thinking also about how do these changes occur? And often there are pivotal moments at evaluation conferences where people talk about something that gives people a whole new insight into something. They read a particular book. There's a new directions in evaluation volume that the American Evaluation Association puts out. There's enough of a momentum and enough of a critical mass and enough good examples. I think that's also really important. People need to have that example to follow. And I think I'm glad there's been that work over the last 20 years, because we need to do it now.
We need it. Yeah, we do.
We need it now. And I think it was never trivial. It was always people were working on serious issues, but the urgency is there. And so this issue, this interesting complexity is not some trendy abstract thing. It's actually saying we need a fundamental shift in how we think about planning.
You want to just mention the document you put in the chat? And then I'm going to hand over to Andy, who wants to make a comment.
Sure. So CCAN, the Centre for Evaluating Complexity across the Nexus. It's the nexus around food and water and energy in the UK, I think, with those areas. They've done some fantastic work on complexity, really looking at what does that mean for how we go about evaluation for policies, the upfront stuff and the further down the track sort of evaluation. So it's very well grounded in terms of the concepts and complexity science, but also immensely practical. So I think that's really good.
I feel I just need to tell people where we're going with this. I made the very bold decision not to do a presentation, so I'm going to be talking through the approach that the Footprint Project has taken to putting together its resources and where we're at right now. And I'm going to just talk you through where we've arrived and how we're planning on thinking about this in future. But before I do that, I'm going to just ask Andy to share his thoughts.
It's always clever to constrain me in time when you're asking me to speak. I think you'll address Dirk's question in the chat as part of what you're doing. I think a number of years ago, I used the phrase all hands on deck, everyone to the nexus. And the nexus has to do with equity and sustainability, it has to do with human and natural systems. All hands on deck said we need all the methods we have. And so Scott and Patricia have been addressing that. But evaluation, I think there are two important things. One is that we don't have much time. And the second is evaluation hasn't been all that useful. And evaluation methods are imbued heavily with the concept of dominion, that what's really important is the human system. So we need to balance this and enrich it and make it more fulsome. We need to bring in other knowledges from other sources. And these are actually really valuable to us. For example, in one project, one case we're looking at right now, we found life cycle costing or life cycle analysis to be a foundation for working with counterfactual alternatives, for talking about environmental effects. That's something that comes from materials science and engineering. In my own work, I use citizen science a lot. So we don't necessarily decolonize data. We value the data and the knowledge that other people have and that they're observing, and we figure out ways to enhance the perceptions of the validity and utility of that data. And modern technology, mobile phones, for example, use of barcodes are making tremendous inroads into the resources, the knowledge resources we can use for sustainability. At the same time, GIS work and all the new layers that exist within GIS, we are able, in the case that Patricia pointed to, looking at a policy, we were able to look below the ground to actual water flows from places with tanneries, because the heavy metals are importantly carried by water systems. And the water systems don't necessarily align with the slope of the land that we can observe. It's the below ground flows and water tables, and we can use GIS for that. But in order to do it, we have to do what Scott has been saying, or what I started writing about 10 or 15 years ago, is we need to expand our spatial and temporal frames to bring in all of the direct effects, everything that interventions reach to. And just to give you an example, giant panda are threatened. The food source for giant panda are particular species of bamboo that exist in forests, for example, in China. The bamboo species reproduce, they're called high-masting bamboo. They reproduce once every 100 years or so. And panda require connectivity between their stands of high-masting bamboo, because they eat it up and they have to go to another one, and these are going to reproduce on long cycles. And tourism, wood for fuel fires, all these for cook fires, all are expanding consumption or destruction of the high-masting bamboo forest and threatening the succession, the possibility of continued survival of giant panda. And giant panda are really important parts of the biodiverse environment that are important to all the reasons we want biodiversity. So all of this is connected. And there is no way you should look at tourism or cook stoves or pandas in China without looking at all these connected elements. So that's what we mean when we talk about the expanding temporal and spatial scales, is that and what Patricia means when they talk about thresholds and things are dynamically, not linearly connected, and there can be feedback effects and loops. All of this is part of it. We tend to say, well, we have to engage complexity. Really, what we also need to do, or the key step in that, is when we think about the intervention, open it up in terms of temporal and spatial scales, seeing everything was there, and figuring out how we're going to incorporate it into the evaluation. We can't wait for advancements in complexity science. We need to be the contributors and the designers of how evaluation is going to address complexity through our actions, through our evaluations, and it's going to be evaluation practitioners that do that. I'm done.
Thanks, Andy. Dirk, do you feel your question's been answered? Do you want to speak directly to the relationship between Footprint and Blue Marble, Andy? They kind of have different levels of analysis, right?
No.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead,
well,
Patricia.
I mean, clearly they're drawing on similar notions in terms of complexity science, complex systems, and how you understand them. But Blue Marble evaluation is specifically about evaluating global systems change. So that's the focus. So it's where the evaluand is not a project or a program or a policy, but a global system and how you change it. So that's its focus. Whereas Footprint is trying to say, how do we consider the environment in all evaluations? And it could be a little local project. It could be a national policy. It's not a global system. And SDG evaluations, again, are drawing on complexity and complex systems because they understand that the different goals are connected and you can't optimize one at the expense of the others. But they also, trying to look at that for each country. So they're at a national level. Again, the structure, they've got a particular focus. That's how I would distinguish them.
And I think Scott's response in the chat box is pretty on point.
Yes.
So I'm really here to ask a question, not to tell you anything. I want to just describe the process that we followed so far, which has been since November 2019. And what we did was Patricia, Jane, Andy, and I met at the AEA conference in Minneapolis and agreed that we share a concern about the extent to which evaluation doesn't take account of sustainability, environmental sustainability, and we resolved to take a long-term approach to trying to change that. So what we have done is a number of things, and I'm going to run through those with you. But what I'd really like and what would make us very grateful would be some of your suggestions in the chat box about other things we can do. So just to note at the outset that the Footprint approach is on the Better Evaluation site, and there is a discussion group that acts as a community of practice. And so those are two of the basic sort of foundational pieces that we have got in place. And if you would go and have a look at them and tell us what you think about them and maybe join the community of practice or look at ways in which you yourself can start making sure that every evaluation talks about environmental sustainability, we'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. I'm going to talk to you quickly about what we did. And one of the first things we did was we convened a group of what we've called thought partners. And these are people that we've done some thinking with, and we've met with them regularly. It's been quite awkward because we span from Melbourne in the east to Seattle in the west, and so getting meetings right has been difficult, but we've managed to sustain that conversation with a group of very thoughtful, committed people who come from a range of backgrounds. We also have taken a lot of care to look at some existing evaluations, and we started with evaluations that we had been involved in because that meant we were able to really understand them. And we used those cases as opportunities to think to ourselves, if we were doing this evaluation now and we wanted to take account of sustainability, what would we do differently? And that was a very interesting experience because what it showed us, for me particularly, I think also for Patricia and Jane, was that there's a depth of technical knowledge that we don't have and that we could only access it because Andy was a member of the team. And it's kind of started to show itself in our thinking in the way Patricia talked about accessing technical expertise if you want to integrate sustainability into your evaluative practice. We also then did some work, which Patricia mentioned, on an actual real-life evaluation where we tried to ensure that the environmental sustainability lens was expanded so that people were able to think more broadly about what was in the terms of reference. Because obviously, one of the key constraints is whether or not the commissioner, when they commissioned the evaluation, made space for a conversation about environmental sustainability. And that's where, for example, the OECD criteria have proved, in fact, to be an amazing opening because they do, in fact, provide space and scope to talk about environmental sustainability in ways that would otherwise perhaps not be available to the evaluator. We've, as I say, we've developed the thematic page on the Better Evaluation site, which has a number of materials. And I think the thing that you may find the most helpful, although it's all pretty useful, is the guidance on framing key evaluation questions so that they take account of environmental sustainability. And you can also access some of the materials that Andy and Jane presented at the beginning of this week as part of their EES training session on footprint evaluation. We've reached the end of what we consider to be our initial phase, where we've developed the outlines of an approach. We've applied it in a couple of evaluations, live and retrospectively. We've essentially settled on a strategy that says we're going to focus on evaluators. We are going to focus on evaluators who are allies. We're not going to try and change the minds of people who are climate denialists because we don't have energy for that. We're going to focus on evaluators rather than commissioners because we feel that that's a community that we resonate with and with whom we have the best access. But we're also very open to being guided by people like yourselves as to how, if you want to change evaluation practice globally, you go about doing that. Maybe a focus on evaluators who are allies is too narrow. Maybe we need to be more ambitious and we need to try and be more risk-taking. But I think in the current context, I don't know about you, but I have limited resilience and I don't really want to expose myself to something that isn't going to succeed. We've also really, I think, settled on, and I see both Boris and Tarana, so thank you. I'm going to give you an opportunity in a second. We kind of putting together this a training course, which is going to be something that will be available to people to build their skills in integrating environmental sustainability into their M&E practice. This is the kind of high-level overview of where we're at, and I'd be very keen to hear what people think. I saw some hands go up, and now I don't know where to see who it was. Patricia, did you see who they were?
Oh, Taruna and Boris, was that right?
Okay, Taruna, please go ahead, and then Boris.
My toddler because it's past 7:30 here, so if you hear her, I apologize.
Okay,
so
that's fine.
I'll be really, really quick. So the first thing I would like to say is that one thing I think that would be useful was talking about project design. So if people who are actually implementing have this notion of sustainability and equity and embedding it, then it might give us something to evaluate.
You
So,
mean
you know,
in terms of the intervention itself rather than just the
yeah,
evaluation? Right.
exactly.
Okay.
So actually incorporating it at that stage and looking at targeting that audience, because that's something you didn't talk about at all, in my opinion. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was sort of getting young emerging evaluators involved, because the more these people talk about it, and I mean, young emerging evaluators, we have sort of our own community and sort of masses, and I mean, what Patricia has done is really, really helpful. One thing a lot of young emerging evaluators struggled with Blue Marble was it wasn't sort of toolification of evaluation, not the checkbox, not the methods and all that. And methods help us with our understanding, and complexity, systems thinking. It's new because we're so results-based management embedded and thinking that way. So I think that's an avenue, whether you want to partner with Evaluate or whether you want to do a few webinars targeted at that sort of level. I think that would be really useful. And I have one more idea which seems to have just flown out of my head, so I will type it in the chat. But
We'll take a moment and see if it comes back. But those are all very helpful ideas. And in fact, there is some work in those regards. I'll let Patricia respond in a moment once Boris has had an opportunity. Boris, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I hope you can all see and hear me.
We can.
I'm listening to you whilst doing some carpentry, so I'm multitasking. But I just wanted to. Nice to see you all. By the way, I think I've seen you and read your work. Look, so I work as an evaluation manager for a reasonably large independent organization, and I just wanted to sort of speak to this question of what can you do. I mean, I think you're probably right to focus on the evaluators. I mean, I think what I'm often disappointed in the evaluation process by is that I am somewhat reliant on the DAC criteria, for better or for worse. But I see the DAC criteria as something that one can read a lot into. If you want to interpret them in a certain way, you can get them to work. But I'm often struck by the inability of evaluators to actually think outside of the box. So they will often answer the questions exactly as written in the terms of reference. That's what they're asked to do, or they will stick loyally to the DAC criteria. And I try to encourage their expertise the process and challenge our thinking a bit around how we are applying the criteria. So in that sense, I think you're right to focus on the evaluators. And I don't want to spiral into a conversation about professionalization of evaluation, although I think it would all help. I suppose the other thing is I would say it's probably not worth taking a conversation with the OECD about the DAC criteria. They've just done a massive consultation process and they still came back with the same narrow definitions.
Right.
So the world will have burned by the time they actually get round to changing them. But I think that what you could do from your position, I think, is to help us, give us the tools, and I mean that quite loosely, but how do we engage in these conversations with our client, who are the operational people, who are the decision makers, the program managers? Because if I go to them with the word sustainability, then, well, quite frankly, all hell breaks loose. So, I mean, everybody's got their own interpretation of what sustainability actually means in the humanitarian and development context. For me, traditionally, sustainability was an environmental thing, and it's been turned into something that's not. Even my office in Stockholm, they talk about a sustainable work environment. So the words become a bit meaningless. And so, and I think so the focus for me would be to give us the tools to take these conversations, because I think sometimes as evaluation managers, we're stuck between the evaluators and the decision makers, and it's not always an easy conversation to take. I'll stop now because my daughter's interrupting me.
That's all super interesting, Boris. It's very nice to see you in your natural habitat. So we're kind of coming towards the end of the session. I see Scott's got some very entrepreneurial suggestions about a pro bono or pay for service support for evaluation teams to write a footprint evaluator or review into proposals as part of the evaluation methodology. Footprint has a checklist. If it involves into its own form of Magenta, it could be used to guide such technical assistance. Scott, what you're talking about isn't wildly different from some of the ideas Jane is keen on, which is kind of to become more entrepreneurial and find a way of financing this initiative that doesn't rely on donors. The work has been funded so far by the program I work with at the World Bank called the Global Evaluation Initiative, and we will continue to put some resources into the follow-up phase. But I do think that we want to also be more, what's the word I want? We want to sort of like set this thing free and like let it make its own way through the world, because I think this is not something that's going to work by controlling it, but rather by providing people with resources and letting them use them in the ways they think best. And which is why I think the suggestion that we focus on young and emerging evaluators is such an important suggestion. So thank you for that, Taruna. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to ask Andy and then Patricia if they'd like to say anything, and then just keep my eye on the box. Hello, Bridget. How very nice to see you. Bridget, is there anything you want to speak to quickly?
Hi, Dougan. Yes, lovely, and lovely to see Patricia and folks. Really enjoyed this. I'm really into the dynamic. I mean, you said, yeah, you've got to choose who to focus on, and I can understand why you're going with evaluators. But actually, I think a lot of the issue that evaluators have is this business of engagement with the particular situation that they are presented with, and how then they get the footprint issues into that potentially rather rigid situation. Therefore, you can choose some very friendly commissioners to start off with, so you're not knocking your head against the proverbial. But I think in the training, that is what I'd go for. That is what people really want. They have all these ideal situations, and then they go out the door and that's not what they're confronted with. What they really want to know is, here's a situation. How do
I do it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And some scenarios and things, or some or whatever, I don't know. I think that could be really helpful. How do you argue your case? And that sounds a bit sort of heavy and whatever, but that's what it boils down to.
Right. Look, I was going to speak about, I had a whole thing I was going to speak about that I completely forgot to talk to, which was this kind of capacity building model that speaks about supply of skills and demand for skills and an enabling environment. But I think the point you're making, Bridget, is the right point. So we've got to look to wrap. I think that it's absolutely unacceptable in these conferences to run late. So I'm going to ask Andy to say a few closing words, and then over to you, Patricia, to finish us off. Andy, hi.
Hi. I have a whole nother world where I develop systems and evaluate environmental conflict resolution. In that world, I see these facilitators, highly skilled facilitators, bring people, warring parties, such as General Electric and the Environmental Defense Fund, bring them to agreement to move forward on what is important to all of them. And so I take the suggestion of other initiatives in other fields. There are other fields who already do this. So Bridget, I think your point's really important, and I think we can turn to these other fields. How do you resolve conflict? How do you reach agreement in highly complex and adversarial situations where the worldviews you're dealing with and the interests that you're dealing with are very much at war or disagreement with each other? And I've evaluated now over 500 cases, and these are very large, high-value cases. And I'm amazed at the human capacity for reaching agreement if we're facilitated appropriately. And I think Dugan is an excellent example of the type of facilitator we need, or the type of evaluator who is able to facilitate across wide spectrums and big differences. So that I think the whole area of capacity building, how do we do it, helping evaluators actually do this and bring to the difficult challenges that they face to be a major part of our undertaking. But I do want to flag that I think we need to recognize that evaluators are behind the ball. We're slowing it down. That quite often we find that commissioners, although they haven't put it in the terms of reference, when you say let's start considering sustainability, they say, sure, we've been waiting for that. We don't know how to do it. I think that in many ways, the worldview and the condition accountability framing of evaluation and a whole bunch of other issues with evaluation are holding us back. And I think the potential is there, both in terms of external ways that conflict resolution works in high-end facilitation. There's a lot we can learn from that, and how to get out of our own way of stopping it and take people where they are, which is much more ready to address sustainability and equity than perhaps we give them credit for.
That's very encouraging, Andy. Thank you. And thank you for the kind words. Patricia, do you want to finish up?
Just very briefly, I think we do need to engage with commissioners, and we need to learn from those who do want to do this and learn how to do that. And I think it's going to be all hands on deck in terms of working out how to do this as well. And I think the sharing of those experiences, what works and what doesn't, is going to be really important for going forward. And I look forward to continuing this and working on this. So yeah, next year, I love the idea that Andy's talked about, that there'll be heaps of people talking about here's what I've done or here's what we've done together, and really having many, many more experiences to share. That's what I think we need to set that as our goal for the next 12 months.
So everybody get over to the Better Evaluation website, look for the footprint theme and join the discussion group, and please contribute and get to be part of the future approach to evaluation. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for the active engagement on the chat box. Great session, thank you. Boris, I don't know who told you you weren't diplomatic. It was a very useful input. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been great to see you.
And Boris is the first person who showed an image that looks like my house. Get over my evaluation career. Thank you. I feel better.
So.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.